could say is that my life is pretty plain. I like watching the puddles gather rain. And all I can do is just pour some tea for two and speak my point of view, but it's not sane. It's not sane. I just want to have what you say. Whoa, oh, oh, oh. What's up, Brian?
That's a hell of a way to start.
Most people are like, that's the first time I've ever been serenaded on a podcast. And I'm like, I bet it is.
It's true.
Well, man, welcome to the Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mirshahzadeh. And boy, do we have a special guest today. My main man, Brian Robertson. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. This should be fun.
So, guys, I'm going to give a quick little background here. So, I every now and again I get the special. I get hit up actually a lot for nowadays for people to be on the show, and normally I'm like meh. But Brian's guy Yoad hits me up, and I'm like, Holacracy, what's that? I'm like, I already knew what it was, but I'm like, whoa, is this guy like promoting like a consulting firm? But by the way, you guys may be like, what the hell is Holacracy? We'll be good talking about that in a second. But I knew what it was, and I was like, this guy like consulting and doing Holacracy stuff. And then I found he's the founder of Holacracy. I'm like, whoa, I want to meet this guy. So, and he's from Austin, which it makes him double as cool, as you guys know. So, guys, Brian is a seasoned entrepreneur. He is an organization builder and a recovering CEO. By the way, I call myself a recovering CEO nowadays, and I'll tell you why in a second. A job he now helps free others from with Holacracy, and we will be talking all things Holacracy today. Generally regarded as a primary developer of the system, and Brian works allows leaders to release the reins of personal power and persuasion into a trustworthy, explicit governance process. Basically, there is no manager, just the holocratic process. He's written the book Holacracy, aptly noted, and it's bestseller. It talks all about the system of Holacracy, and he's a steward of the Holacracy Constitution, which captures the system's unique rules of the game in concrete form. Didn't you do a TEDx talk too about Holacracy?
Yes, I did. Yep.
And we have so much in common. I was a TEDx curator. So my man, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Wow. Let's chop it up. So Brian, do you mind if I tell you how I got you?
I'm so curious. Please do. Yeah.
All right. Well, two things. So first of all, I'm originally from California, but I ran to Austin, Texas about 4 years ago. 4 years ago this weekend, actually. Cool. But I came here. My wife's family's from here. They actually founded a restaurant that's near your house called the County Line Restaurant.
Oh yeah, I know it.
So that's my wife's family's restaurant. They founded that.
Cool.
Anyhow, I was really, I got really into core values, and I wrote a book called The Core Value Equation, which I just published in September. And I got really into core values probably 2008 was when it started. And then in 2012 or 13, there was this book called Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I like Tony Hsieh's work. I was in San Francisco, so he was a San Francisco guy. I was a San Francisco guy. He had moved his business to Vegas, as we all know, and Zappos became Zappos. And I was like kind of halfway obsessed with Zappos. In fact, I was trying to build the Zappos of mortgage. That's what I called myself. So, in fact, I actually had an article written in Entrepreneur Magazine called "How to Become the Zappos of Your Industry." And so, I, being a stalker, went to Vegas and went and did a tour of Zappos. And that was my first introduction to this thing called Holacracy. And I'm like, oh, yeah, they do this holocratic approach to management. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, oh, there are no managers. I'm like, what do you mean there are no managers? Now, I'm in like the most old school command and control industry you can be in. I'm in mortgage industry, which is like, it's essentially like being in like the soup can manufacturing business. It's like everything has, and it's super highly regulated, and everything has you literally get in trouble if you don't have a management system there. Like you have to have a hierarchy, or I think you get shut down by the regulators because they want to know who signs off on stuff, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have a checker checking the checker, as my former partner used to say. Right. But I got introduced to this by literally being in Zappos and seeing Zappos. Now, can I give you my honest feedback of what I saw when I was there?
Yeah, curious.
Which I don't know if that had anything. I think this was more cultural than than a blazing indictment of holacracy. But I was like, man, this place is a fucking shit show. I was like, it's like you could do whatever you wanted. Like it was like just and I'm a really visual person, like really visual. Like I like clean lines. I'm kind of a minimalist. But if you don't have any rules, then you end up with what I call the Berkeley, California effect, which is everyone paints their house every shitty color they want because their taste sucks. And I'm like, I actually was like, this feels like it's counterproductive. So my perspective was that is maybe the shadow of holacracy is people do whatever how they want. And maybe it has nothing to do with holacracy, but that was the taste that was left in my mouth because half of me was like, I want to have holacracy in my business. Why should I just sit there and manage people? Like, why can't they manage themselves? They don't want to be managed anyway. I know they don't. Nobody wakes up and is like, man, I can't wait for my boss to breathe out my neck and give me shit, And no boss is like, boy, what am I going to do today? Oh, I'm going to go fuck some people
micromanage.
Yeah. I can't wait to go manage people. That'll be awesome, right? So you have like two unwilling parties being forced into this box. So it's an artificial system that we've created because of probably the Industrial Revolution, and one could argue it's super outdated. So I go back to my partners and I start talking to my one partner. He's like, "That's a really cool, and it would never work in our industry."
Heard that so many times.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. So that was where I left it. But anyway, that when I saw that you were the one of the creators of holacracy, if not the creator of holacracy, I was like, oh, I got to meet this guy. So anyway, that's my origin story on your life's work.
That's hilarious. You've actually also hit several misconceptions about holacracy in that, which is awesome because they're so common. It's what everyone thinks when they first see this, especially if they tour a company like Zappos, where actually holacracy brought in more rules, not less, than they had before.
Yeah.
The single biggest pushback I think people had in Zappos on holacracy is that there were too many new rules.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But again, it's so common when people hear there are no managers and no management hierarchy. They think what you're saying is there's no structure, right? They think you're saying no rules, anyone can do anything. And it's not that at all. There's more structure, not less than in a management hierarchy. We just get to the structure differently, right? And that's why you talked about what industries. We have this in highly regulated industries. In fact, several government agencies, which are even more than regulated industries, use holacracy. So it's not about the absence of rules. It's about how you generate the rules and how everyone can get involved in changing them. But anyway, we can talk more about all that.
Yeah, no, I want to dive into it. Before we go there, though, could you mind if give us a little bit of background on yourself and how you got to that turning point of creating this thing that's now, like I said, your life's work. Like, give us your background. How did you, you're obviously a recovering CEO. Give us the origin story, the start.
Yeah, so I almost 20 years ago now, I started a software company. My background's in software, and I started the company with just this burning sense. There's just got to be a better way to do this, right? I've been in larger companies, and I kept seeing again and again the system and structure around me seemed to get in the way of the work more than any technical software challenge we faced, right? It was the human system and the organizational system around us that seemed to limit innovation and creativity much more than any technical problem ever did. And so I had this sense of there's just got to be a better way to do this, but I didn't know what it was. So I turned my company into a laboratory. I basically said, look, I don't know the answer to this, but in the past, I always saw change was blocked. It was like the system around us was built to resist people having an insight and driving some change with it. It was built to maintain the status quo. And as I researched and studied management more, I learned that's actually exactly what it was designed for, right? Wow. Management hierarchy emerged when the main problem we had was how do we get compliance around a standard and get people to shut up, stop thinking, and comply with strategy from above. Most of the workforce, when we came up with modern management hierarchy, most of the workforce was illiterate. And it was built for that kind of environment, not an environment where you need innovation, agility, creativity, or anything like that. So, my software company was it was a laboratory. It was, let's just try stuff. And we went out and I read every management book I could find, every new idea, technique, process, whatever it was. We just experiment with it and see what worked. And eventually we started running our own experiments. And over years of experimentation in that company, we came up with what is now called Holacracy, which is a different framework for running a company. But it was, the origin was not, this didn't come from an academic. It didn't come from theory. It came from just a lot of trial and error, a lot of hands-on practice in a real business.
So it's funny. You just reminded me of this conversation I had about 22 years ago. I went on this thing called Semester at Sea when I was in college, and where you go on a ship around the world. So I'm on the back of the boat and I meet this guy. Yeah, it's really badass. One of the best things I ever did. But I'm on the back of the ship and I'm off of the coast of Israel, and I meet this guy who's a Baha'i, and he's explaining to me what the Baha'i faith is, which sounds like it's essentially the holacracy of religion. But he's like, well, you know what the origin of religion is, Darius? And I said, well, what's that? He said, well, like majority of the population was illiterate and they had to control them, so they created religion. Now our religious viewers, which are probably zero given the number of F-bombs I like to drop, are probably ran for the door. But yeah, it's funny, like when you're creating systems for an uneducated mass population, then there is no room for creativity because it's not coming from a place of maybe deep understanding or of academic context, right? It's just coming from, and one could argue that it doesn't matter either way, but they do need to be able to get people to do stuff who can't read the directions, right? Yeah. So like, what do you mean I can't kill someone? Nope. God said thou shalt not kill. You're going to argue with the big guy or girl upstairs? Like, no, I don't want to argue with him. Hey, he's going to smite you down, and so I could see the same thing from a command and control system. It was created to get a consistent result, create efficiency. That one could argue that early management system, given the work, I guess maybe the ability of that workforce, was the technology, right? That was the technology of that time.
Yeah, it was. And the technology was well suited for the environment at the time, right? Management hierarchy is not in any way a bad idea or an insane practice. It was brilliant for the world it emerged in. It's just, why are we still using technology that was the telegraph was an exciting new invention when this management technology came about? Why are we still using that technology, right? The world has changed dramatically since then.
Right. So you started that in your company. Do you mind kind of giving us a little bit of the maybe a visual of what the early learnings of, obviously you had probably a traditional infrastructure at that point, org chart, hierarchy, policies and procedures. Hey boss, can I go to the bathroom? Raise your hand. Obviously, like that's what most companies have, some version of that. Yeah. How did you guys go did you guys just say, screw it, rip out the guts and start from scratch? Or did you guys unwind it? Walk us through how you went from the traditional management system that everyone was using, and probably yourself included, to what holacracy is. And maybe before we go there, explain what holacracy is. And then we can go back to the beginnings and how you got to the end result.
Yeah. So, well, let me just say a couple of things about how we got there, because they'll point to what it actually is, or what it's not, which is probably more important, because it's so easy to get the wrong idea with this stuff. I made the same mistake that so many companies make when they start pioneering and innovating with different approaches. At first, I thought, hey, a lot of this structure becomes bureaucratic and gets in the way, so let's get rid of a lot of structure, a lot of rules, a lot of processes. And the problem is, just throwing that out isn't enough. You have to replace it with something. When you try to go to more of a quote flat, company or whatever, by getting rid of layers of management and layers of bureaucracy and process, you often end up with something that's really difficult to get alignment and coordination and control. And you need those things. You need alignment, you need coordination, you need controls in a business, right? You can't, especially in your industry, right? You can't just throw that shit out.
Right.
So, that was one of the mistakes. Just throw it out. No, that doesn't work. Now it's just chaos. And there are some advantages of that, but there's also a whole lot of problems with that, right? Oh, right. Sorry about the background noise we're at right now.
No. Hey, tell his manager to tell him to knock it off. And
right. Yeah. So, Yeah, then we tried that. So we also tried, what if we wanted people to be able to have more voice in decisions, because I believe there's a lot of wisdom in the frontline staff of your organization, right? So we thought, well, we'll try more consensus-based processes. And that's a total disaster. That's leads to what I call the tyranny of consensus, which is where everyone has a voice.
We all have to agree. We all have to agree, Brian.
Everything. That's a terrible idea, right?
Best ideas are when everyone agrees.
Yeah. So early on, I'm in my 20s when I'm doing this experimentation in the early days of this. And yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It wasn't, right? Like, so lots of early experimentation that would just prove to be really bad ideas. So where we eventually landed many, many years later is something that is the opposite of what people often assume when they hear no managers, right? It's highly structured. It's just we get to structure differently. Holacracy is a role-based system. So there's a lot of clear roles. In fact, there's a software tool we use for this. I can pull up my software tool. I can show you everyone's roles in my company. We have many roles. I have 20 roles in 5 different teams in my company. Lots of people have many roles. And I can show you clearly the purpose of every role, the why of every role, right? I can show you clearly the expectations on every role. So we have a really clear structure. But unlike a traditional job description, the structure, it means something, right? Like in most companies, when's the last time you went and looked up your job description? Nobody cares, right? They're not real. The clarity is something somebody wrote, a year ago, or someone in HR did, or whatever. It's just not real. With Holacracy, that clarity comes from teams learning together. So there's a process in every team to update the structure and the policies of that team. This is in every team doing this. So we're learning together, right? Instead of the manager creating structure, which theoretically we want managers to do, but most of them suck at it, right? Instead of that, the team learns together. So we show up and we have a little retrospective. What happened in our past few weeks? What did we learn about our natural working process? What did we learn about the policies? What's in the way or what's needed? And we clarify that. And there's a whole process to this structure of this meeting. But the output is a really clear structure that you can count on that actually does matter. And when you have that kind of clear structure, you can then really empower it, right? So one of the things that Holacracy does is take a stance that says, when you're leading your role, you have the authority and the freedom to make any decision you want anywhere in the company to get the job done within the boundaries or the rules we've created together. We're going to need those. We can't throw out all boundaries. You need to know your boundaries or you don't know your freedom. Right. So, if you don't know the limits, you don't know your power.
Right. So what can you give like a concrete example of that? Because I think it's a little bit abstract,
totally
outside of so let's talk about a role that like the audience would be like, oh, I fully get what he means by that.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the role I'm doing right now. I fill a role called Holacracy spokesperson. I give a lot of interviews, podcasts, conference talks, that kind of thing. And I get to spread the word about what this thing is and why it exists in the world. So that's one of many roles I fill. It's a role I'm doing right now. And to fill that role, to lead that role, I have the freedom to kind of use my judgment. I lead it. I make the decisions that I want to make. So does everyone else in their role. But there's also some boundaries. So for example, another role I work with, we're in our broader marketing team, right? Another role I work with manages our website. That role controls the website. So I can make any decision I want, but I can't mess with the website without checking with them. And it doesn't matter that I'm the founder of the company and she's one of our newer people. Doesn't matter at all. All that matters is she controls the website in her role. She has her purpose and her accountabilities, right? And I have mine. I lead my role. She leads hers. We're both CEOs of our role, effectively. Right? She doesn't have to check in with me, but she does have some clear expectations. I don't have to check in with anyone else, but if I want to mess with the website, I need to check in with her. So we break up control, just like society, right? I know I can live my life and use my judgment, but I can't go take my neighbor's property, right? That my neighbor controls that. We have boundaries. Right. When we know our boundaries, we know our freedom.
So in a holacratic environment, is there a CEO or no CEO?
Yeah, not in an internal sense. You might still use that title for the external world if that's useful in the business, right? If you still want to have somebody show up that way, sure. But internally to the business, there's no one that has that kind of command authority.
Understood. And so let's go back to this idea of role. How many roles can one person have?
There's no limit other than just practically how many hats can you juggle. I have 20 some, and that's a lot. There's not many people that have more than 20, 30 roles.
Wait, you have 20 roles in your company?
I do. Just like in life, right? Like You might be the dishwasher in your house. You might be the finance person or whatever. You have many hats you wear. Same.
Are they ranked from a hierarchical standpoint for each person, or you just have them and those are the things you own?
Roles I do, yeah, they're the work I do, right? So I do coordinate our taxes. I'm doing that right now with our external CPA, right? I have that role. It's not very much fun. I have our spokesperson role. That one's a lot more fun. I do just a number of other things. I do our trainings. I'm one of our trainers. So lots of different roles.
So a way for a more layman like myself to think about this would be everything I own can be defined in a role with boundaries and deliverables, as well as expectations and accountability.
That's right. And you can define exactly that. What do you control, and what are your responsibilities that come with the power to lead that role?
So let me ask a question. So let's say I'm a CMO of a normal company. CMO is going to be the person that maybe the role they own is the strategic brand architecture of the company. They would not own in a traditional environment. They would own all the output that department, the marketing department, creates. They would own. So I'm just going to use an example of my former business. Our CMO would have owned all the creative content that's created, our creative arc for the year, strategy around taking marketing to market. Right, they're going to own like that high level. And then under them, they're going to have the team getting the work done. Now, what ended up happening, what I would see is, maybe they would have to jump in to fix things, or they would have to, push to hit deadlines. And so I saw one of the things that I witnessed was, and my complaint would have been that, man, that person's, if they weren't there, then those jobs wouldn't get done probably to the best of the department's ability. Mm-hmm. How would a holacracy change that? Yeah.
So to start with, you'd start exactly where you are, right? You just break it up and define the roles more clearly. Like that CMO probably has a lot of roles, right? I find this often when I'm working with companies. When you get the 3-letter titles, there's a lot of roles in there, right? Like I worked with a CFO a little while back who realized, okay, he has an accounts payable management role, like that's just managing the process of accounts payable. He's got an accounting standards role that defines their accounting standards. Lots of different roles, right? So you break down the roles to start. You don't change a damn thing. Like if you want, you have maybe a copywriter role, and what's happening right now is the copywriter role kind of runs their copy by somebody with a lot more seasoning and strategic focus. Great, create roles for both. Have a strategic brand role and a copywriting role. Have the copywriting role have a clear accountability for getting input from the strategic brand role before publishing something or whatever. Start there. Start where you are.
The accountability would be that, hey, my job is to create copy. And one of the levels of my accountability is I must always get quality assurance from the copywriter signer offer role.
Possibly, yeah, you can do that. Now, the question that you have to ask, and this conversation is really powerful, what level of autonomy does that role have? Right? Do you really want them to have absolutely no authority to make any judgments whatsoever? Well, if that's what you really want, you can do that. Holacracy doesn't prevent it, right? But in reality, that's probably not what you want. Maybe you want them to not have to even get an approval, but just solicit input. That's like a lower level standard, and that's often the case. You want them to use their judgment, but you want to make sure they get input. Sometimes for certain important key decisions, you want a little stronger. You want somebody having to go actually get an approval for something specific from another role, but not for everything they do, for some defined things, right? So the first step is just define all this. Let's be clear, and then tell people within the standards we've created, stop giving your power up to someone else, stop looking to be told what to do, and start leading your piece within these expectations. Lead your decisions, lead your piece.
Right.
Then let's let that structure change, because we're going to learn together. There's going to be times where that strategic brand role says, stop coming to me with all this stuff. You're wasting my time. They might want to reduce the amount of stuff coming to them, right? Or the other person might say, hey, like this is slowing me down for stuff that isn't needed. We can just change it if it's not good. Why don't I just retain the right to lead this piece? So the goal is not to get the perfect structure up front. It's to map what you have, right? But be clear, where do you really need limits? And within them, give freedom. And then evolve the structure. Let it change. Let it adapt.
So going back to that it's funny when you're saying this, is I think that the ideology of this was something I actually personally naturally did with all of my. I think I'm naturally a holacratic manager or leader, just because I used to tell people I'm like, I don't want to be involved, right?
Yep, totally.
What I do is I want to be there to help you when you need help.
Yeah,
and you tell me what you're going to get done, and we can agree on it, right? So this is like this organic agreement, right? It wasn't documented, but I hear what you're saying, which is, hey, look, tell the copywriter. And what's interesting is if you look at a board, right? Because I think a board is actually kind of an interesting example of this.
Yes, it is.
In a corporation, you have board governance, right? Mm-hmm. So because there's so much legality and risk and I guess responsibility associated with the board, they actually kind of create this. They say, okay, this decision needs to get approved at the board. Everything else you have full autonomy to do without, right?
Yep.
So, but people, and then you get into the organization and it's a cobweb of I guess murkiness, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing. This is what we want a good manager to do anyway. We don't want managers that micromanage. We want managers that create clarity. But the trouble is we don't give them much tools or support for that in most companies, and it's really hard, right? Ideally, you want a manager, like you're saying, that doesn't just boss people around, but says, here are your expectations, here are your limits. Within them, I'm not going to micromanage. You go lead, but honor these boundaries. You want that kind of clarity. What you often get are managers that aren't good at that. And when you get one that is good at that, they get promoted and replaced by someone who's not good at that because there's not enough to go around, right? So what Holacracy does is prevent the micromanagement so they can't take the easy road out. You don't have the authority to micromanage in this system. You have to create clarity, right? So the old bosses, they're not bosses anymore, but they do have access to the same process that everyone else does, where we can define the roles and define the boundaries. So they can drive clarity to that, and they have to, but they also have a language and a process that helps them do that. It's not just good luck, create clarity. It's here's what role definitions are. Here are the rules of the game. Here's the process where you can shape it. And by the way, everyone else is going to be helping you do that. It's not all on you anymore. So
if you look at, for instance, a position, let's say let's say you roll this out in an organization. What I'm hearing you say is that the system, the holacratic system, is a discipline.
Yes.
It's an adoptive process, but it's a discipline. Really, people are doing their job, but the nuances in how it's being managed, and where there are boundaries and where there's autonomy.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
And the chasm people need to cross is the discipline around role clarity, role iteration, and then and once you have that and some sort of process around moving the entire organization with that, then you're essentially a holacratic organization. Am I thinking of this right?
Yeah, there's some processes to it, like the process, we call it our governance process, where people can update roles and all that. And then there's the discipline of actually using it. So for ex-bosses, this is not just staying in the old habit of micromanaging, right? But using the process to drive clarity. And for people on the front line, it's not deferring to the old bosses, looking to be micromanaged or told what to do, and instead leading your part and stepping up, right? And then using the process to drive clarity when you need something different from the boss, right? Or the ex-boss. You can expect things from them too. It's not just a simple command hierarchy anymore, so expectations go in all directions here.
So again, this is like the argument or I guess the challenge around schools that don't give grades, right? Is that the outside world doesn't recognize it. So do you find that people still have titles, but there's no? So could you have a vice president of quality assurance, and then you have an associate of quality assurance? The role of they don't report to nobody. I guess nobody really reports to anybody. That their roles define their obligations, and their roles might have certain obligations that cross-pollinate with other people. Am I thinking this right?
That's true. Yeah, and so what some companies do when there's a need to give people something to put on a resume, they make some standards. Like if you have roles that have these kinds of functions, right, then you can claim this title. The title means nothing internally, but we'll back it in a reference check, right? So sometimes they do that. Some companies just throw out titles and they say, you figure out whatever the hell you want to put on your resume. We don't care. Find something appropriate. We'll tell people what you actually do and show them all your roles if they ask, Lots of ways you can do it.
So let me ask a question. So like, because I'm a student of the game of scale, growing businesses. I grew my last business. I exited my last company in July, but I grew that company to about 1,000 employees. And I've always bootstrapped my businesses and grown them. And so for me, I got very into the systems around scale. Some of those, Gino Wickman calls it entrepreneurial operating system. Yep. So there's traction and scaling up, and some people like to use OKRs. Probably that's something you're really familiar with, being a software business. And so I like, and I'm integral. So I kind of like all sorts of systems and kind of putting them all together. That's what, so one of my questions would be, there's a discipline around those systems. So let's say I have a strategic framework around where I'm doing quarterly strategic meetings. I have everyone show up who's appropriate for the role, who's in their role. It says you need to be a part of the strategic meeting where we talk strategy because they own strategy for that function in the business. And then we have these, so that would be more of a strategic model, right? And we're establishing, I guess, whoever owns that would work with the other owners of strategy to build the quarterly strategic initiatives. Am I thinking about all this right?
Totally. Yep. Get clear roles, and then also, what do you expect of other roles around aligning with those strategies, and where's the boundary between what they're expected to align with and what they're using their own judgment to decide? Holacracy doesn't push an answer to that on you. It's just making you get clear with that, and then allowing that to change as you realize, some things you might be over controlling and some things under controlling. This thing in most businesses, it's not that everything's over controlled. Often there's a lot under controlled that you need more controls around. And there's a lot of other stuff that's over controlled that's just pure bureaucracy that you need to peel away controls on. Most businesses do not get the level of control right because there is no universal answer. It needs to be different in different questions in different parts of the business.
Interesting.
So what you need is a process that lets you adapt to that and find the right level of control for the team, for the process, for the context. And that's a moving target. So it needs to be able to evolve. And that, to me, is the magic of Holacracy. It's giving you a language and a process to evolve everything else, to evolve what we expect, what are the controls, what are the alignment, expectations, the limits, everything.
So with that being said, if you're using things like, let's say, an all hands meeting or I guess you don't have executives, but execution role owner, right? They own all the execution of the strategic items and the business as usual items. And they're going to meet once a week to go over what's happening in those areas, to review KPIs or production challenges, where they're at on the quarterly strategic initiatives. All this, those more traditional strategic execution frameworks stay in place. Holacracy kind of fits on top of that based off of how things are happening. But yeah, you're still going to have your 10-year plan. You're still going to have your 3-5-year plan, 1-year plan, quarterly initiatives associated with those things. How those things interact are a little bit, how they come to be and how they're owned are different. Is that correct?
Yeah. So you might, and some businesses do. Others find that sometimes the planning is like almost especially predictive future planning becomes an excuse. At least we're doing something to try to get some kind of control and alignment. And sometimes you find when you have a more dynamic approach, you need less predictive planning, but it really depends on the business. But what you're spot on is Holacracy is a meta framework. So it's not telling you how to break down, your specific strategic initiatives, what your goals should be. It's not telling you how to run your business, what your roles should be, what your business processes should be. It's giving you the meta framework to define and evolve all of that, right? So it's compatible with a lot of other things. We have a lot of companies using it with OKRs right now, right? Because OKRs are operating at a totally different level of scale. What are our objectives and results we're going for? Holacracy is what's the meta framework so that we can change the expectations on each other and the boundaries between our roles, right? Which is a missing piece. We look to management hierarchy to do that, and management hierarchy is a terrible tool for that in a dynamic environment.
Interesting. And so, it seems kind of like an obvious thing because I'll go back to it, like, especially when you talk about governance, right? This is it sounds like a governance process.
Yep, it is. It's exactly what it is.
And so what's interesting is in a traditional, this is it's really legal more than anything from a corporate governance standpoint. All boards do this already, but they're doing it at the board level, and then the buck stops at the board. It doesn't happen below the board.
That's right. And if it makes sense to do at the board level, maybe it makes sense to do at other levels too, right? At least in a complex environment. Yeah.
Right. So for people that are interested in doing, well, let me ask you a question, because this all sounds good and great, but is there data that supports that this creates better outcomes?
Yeah, there is. So there have been several studies now. Harvard Business School did a couple of studies now on this. We're waiting for the results to be published, which takes years in academia, but we've had some really good interviews. In fact, you can find a couple of them recorded on the web with the main researcher from Harvard that did this, and fascinating data. We've also had other data collection. For example, just to give a taste, it was a government agency actually that adopted Holacracy for this data point, and they measured before and after 6 months of Holacracy, how many meeting minutes did it take to get a clear answer, a clear decision or action from somebody else when you needed one. And the reduction was over 90%. Over 90% less meeting minutes needed to get a clear action or clear decision from someone else, right? Which is, I think, pretty remarkable. Even more remarkable, though, they also tried to measure how many meeting minutes does it take when what you need is a change to a policy of the organization or to somebody else's job or role in Holacracy language. And they wanted to measure the improvement of that, but they couldn't, because all the surveys came back infinite from before Holacracy. In other words, people would say, we've been talking for years about some of these changes, and they are not possible to make. We cannot drive change to our policies or to other people's job functions. Right after Holacracy, it was an average of about 20 meeting minutes for any one significant change to a policy or a right? So that's not just an efficiency improvement. That's a new capacity that the organization did not have before, right? So I think that's an interesting one. Another one of the Harvard studies measured what about perception of job performance from peers, and that was an interesting one. What they actually measured after Holacracy, people that were rated as generally above average, good performers before Holacracy, got way better, like way better. But people that were generally measured as poor performers before Holacracy actually got worse in the system, which from my background as a former CEO and just general business guy, I love that, right? I want my poor performers to stand out. I don't want them to be just a little poor. I want them to be horrible because when they're horrible, it's obvious and I can deal with it and I can get them the hell out of there, right? Or change something dramatic or whatever. And that's exactly what Holacracy did. The good performers were freed and got way better. And the poor performers stood out. They got worse. And then the organizations could adapt to that and get them into a better role for them or get them out or whatever was needed. So yeah, fascinating. There's lots of other data out there, but those are just some little anecdotes.
That's crazy. And so there was a company down, and I know we're kind of rounding towards the end of the show, but I forgot to mention this early in the show. I heard of a company in Brazil and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're this like publicly traded company. I think it's like a conglomerate, and they're famous for being holacratic. I believe so. Am I thinking?
I know what you're thinking of. They don't use Holacracy, but they use a custom homegrown self-management framework. So before Holacracy came on the scene, there were a lot of companies that did self-management, not a lot, actually, a small handful, but there was no standard framework. So they kind of just had to hack together their own unique approach.
Right.
The famous one, Semco in Brazil, there's Morningstar in the US, which is $1 billion revenue tomato processing company. They have no managers, lots of employees, no managers. So there are examples like that, but it wasn't until Holacracy came on the scene like 10 years ago that the self-management movement started really thriving and flourishing, because now you don't have to reinvent the wheel and find a homegrown way of doing this, which takes a long time to work out. Now you have a generic framework that you can just adopt, and it shortens the learning curve for this and the transition curve dramatically. And that's why there's now thousands of companies all over that do this instead of dozens as there were about 20 years ago.
It's so cool. Well, man, Brian, you're rocking my world, man. This is so cool. It's really interesting to hear the story behind this and to get some clarity around what sounds like an organic way to grow a business, the way that people want to be managed, and the way that recovering CEOs like yourself and myself really want to manage the business. I don't want to manage the business. I don't want to manage anybody. Exactly. I barely want to manage myself.
I want to be an entrepreneur, not a manager. And I think that's true of most managers.
Totally. So where can people find you? And why don't we give we'll put this in the show notes, but yeah, where can people find you and get hooked up with you and all the cool things that you're up to and that you're doing?
Yeah, totally. So the website, holacracy.org. People misspell holacracy all the time. So if you're actively typing it, it's HOLACRACY.org. You'll find there's online trainings, events, free resources, videos, lots of stuff on there. So find the website, see what makes sense. And you can always reach out to my company through there. Just click contact us. And we have coaches all over the world that we can hook you up with somebody local to chat with. Yeah, reach out if we can help.
Very cool, guys. Well, Brian, thank you so much for being on the show, my friend. It was a pleasure to learn from you and to learn all the amazing things that you're doing. And dude, keep going out there and spreading the greatness known as Holacracy and of it yourself. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Darius. This was fun.
Yeah, so much so, guys. Take care. We'll talk to you guys later. Peace. We're out of here.